I always believed in the strength of family. I lived by the idea that loyalty and trust were the foundation of a happy life. And for 14 years I thought I had it: a loving wife, 3 beautiful children, and a home filled with warmth. My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how my entire world was torn apart in the cruelest way imaginable. It all started with an innocent request, something that shouldn't have meant anything. My oldest son, Ethan, was preparing for his high school biology project, a simple study on genetic traits. He needed to compare DNA markers between parents and children to showcase hereditary patterns. I thought nothing of it when he asked me to participate. "Come on, Dad," he had said, grinning as he waved the DNA swab in front of me. "It's just for school. Mom already did hers." "Sure, why not?" I chuckled, taking the swab and rubbing it inside my cheek. My wife, Jessica, stood by the kitchen counter, sipping her tea, a smile on her lips but her eyes distant. If only I had known what she was hiding behind that carefully composed expression. A few weeks passed, and I barely gave the test a second thought. That was until Ethan came home one afternoon, his face pale, hands trembling as he clutched a folder of printed results. "Dad," his voice cracked as he placed the papers on the kitchen table. "I think there's something wrong." I glanced at the results, my stomach tightening with unease. It was just a school project, yet the numbers, the letters, the words, they made no sense. "What do you mean?" I asked, flipping through the pages. Ethan swallowed hard. "The results say we don't share any genetic markers, Dad. Not just a few differences, none. Like, you're not my biological father." His words hit me like a sledgehammer. My throat went dry, my hands suddenly cold. I turned to Jessica, expecting her to laugh, to tell me this was a mistake, that it was all just some scientific anomaly. But she didn't. Instead, she went pale, gripping the edge of the counter as though the weight of the truth might make her collapse. "It must be a lab error," she said too quickly. "Maybe Ethan mixed up the samples." Ethan shook his head. "Mom, I double-checked everything. I even ran it again just to be sure." A sharp silence filled the room. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat screaming that something was terribly wrong. I grabbed my phone and pulled up a private DNA testing service. My hands trembled as I ordered a full paternity test, not just for Ethan, but for my other 2 children, Lily and Noah. Jessica didn't try to stop me. She just stood there, her face drained of color. That should have told me everything. The week that followed was the longest of my life. Every second felt like a slow countdown to something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I barely spoke to Jessica, barely looked at her. I was afraid of what I might see in her eyes. The results arrived on a Friday morning. I sat alone in my car, parked just a block away from my house, gripping the envelope with sweaty hands. I wanted to rip it open. I wanted to throw it away. But I had to know. I took a deep breath and unfolded the papers. Line after line of cold, clinical text stripped away every illusion I had ever believed in. Ethan, 0% match. Lily, 0% match. Noah, 0% match. None of them were mine. My vision blurred, my breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. I felt like I was drowning, like the world had suddenly lost its gravity, and I was free-falling into an abyss I couldn't escape from. 14 years. 14 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, birthday parties, and whispered I love yous. 14 years of being a father, only to learn that it had all been a lie. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. My fingers hovered over Jessica's name before I clenched my jaw and pulled away. No. Not yet. Not until I had all the answers. I forced myself to drive home, my mind replaying every memory, every moment, now twisted with a horrifying new perspective. The stolen glances, the business trips, the unexplained late nights, had it all been part of the deception? When I stepped through the front door, Jessica was waiting. She must have seen the look on my face because her eyes instantly filled with fear. "You got the results?" she whispered. I tossed the papers onto the kitchen table. "Tell me the truth, Jessica." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I had no sympathy left to give. How long? My voice was hollow. How long have you been lying to me? Jessica trembled, her lips quivering as she tried to speak. And when she finally did, it was the moment that destroyed me completely. From the beginning, she confessed, her voice barely audible. I staggered back as though she had physically struck me. The air in the room became thick, suffocating. The beginning. Our entire marriage had been a lie. I turned away from her, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. My mind screamed at me to yell, to break something, to demand answers. But all I could do was whisper the only question that truly mattered now. Who is their father? Jessica flinched, as if the very idea of admitting it was too much to bear. Daniel, please. Who? I cut her off, my voice ice cold. She hesitated, and then, finally, she spoke. It's not just one man. My stomach twisted violently. My vision darkened at the edges. Not just one man. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly. Then I walked past her, straight into our bedroom, grabbing a suitcase from the closet. Daniel, please! We can fix this! She sobbed, following me. But there was nothing left to fix. I wasn't their father. I wasn't her husband. I was just a fool who had spent 14 years living someone else's lie. And now, I was done. I didn't hear Jessica's cries as I packed my things. My mind had retreated somewhere far away, to a place where her voice couldn't reach me, where memories didn't sting like acid against raw skin. Every shirt I folded, every drawer I yanked open felt mechanical, like my body was moving on autopilot while my soul stood frozen in disbelief. Daniel, stop! Jessica's voice cracked as she grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin like claws desperate to hold on. You can't just leave! I yanked my arm free, my gaze as cold as the hollow space growing in my chest. Watch me. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. Not in this house filled with echoes of laughter that suddenly felt counterfeit, walls painted with memories I now questioned. I left the suitcase half-zipped, grabbed my keys off the nightstand, and headed for the door. Dad? The small voice stopped me cold. Ethan stood at the bottom of the staircase, his hair tousled, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Behind him, Lily and Noah peeked out from their bedroom, their innocent faces etched with confusion and fear. Where are you going? Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. I felt my heart tear in two. For a split second, I considered lying, wrapping this nightmare in a neat, comforting package. But what was the point? Their entire existence had been wrapped in lies already. I just need some time, I muttered, my voice foreign even to my own ears. Ethan's brows furrowed. But we're your family. Family? The word hit me harder than Jessica's betrayal. I wanted to scream that they weren't mine, that I'd been living someone else's life, raising someone else's children. But their eyes, those eyes that once looked at me with unconditional love, now filled with something worse than confusion, fear. Jessica rushed over, wrapping her arms around Ethan. Go back to bed, sweetheart. Daddy's just upset. Everything's fine. Fine. I nearly laughed, a bitter, humorless sound caught in my throat. Without another word, I walked out the door. I didn't remember much of the drive. The road blurred under the headlights as rain began to fall, tapping against the windshield like the soft knock of guilt trying to get in. I found myself in front of an old motel on the outskirts of town, the neon sign flickering as if mocking me. The room was as hollow as I felt, peeling wallpaper, a stained carpet, and a single bed that looked like it hadn't been comfortable since the 90s. I didn't care. I dropped my bag and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of everything I'd just left behind. I was free. So why did it feel like I couldn't breathe? I pulled out my phone. Dozens of missed calls from Jessica. Texts flooded in, each one more frantic than the last. Jessica, please, Daniel, come back. We can talk about this. Jessica, the kids are asking about you. They're scared. Jessica, I love you. We need you. They need you. I threw the phone across the room, shattering the silence but not the ache inside me. I lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling. My mind raced with images: Ethan's first soccer game, Lily's ballet recital, Noah learning to ride a bike. Their laughter echoed in my ears, but now it felt like someone else's life playing on repeat. Were those moments real? Or just part of the elaborate illusion Jessica had crafted? The next morning, I found myself parked outside my best friend Marcus's apartment. He'd been my confidant for years, the guy I leaned on when life got rough. When he opened the door, one look at me and his usual sarcasm vanished. "Jesus, Dan. You look like hell." I didn't respond. I just walked past him and collapsed onto his couch. "What happened?" he asked gently, grabbing 2 beers from the fridge. I took a long sip before finally speaking. "They're not mine," I whispered. Marcus frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The kids. Ethan, Lily, Noah. I did a DNA test, none of them are mine." He froze, the beer bottle halfway to his lips. "You're kidding." I laughed bitterly. "Do I look like I'm kidding?" Marcus sat down beside me, shaking his head in disbelief. "What the hell, man? How is that even possible?" "Jessica." I spat her name like poison. She admitted it. Said it's not just one guy, there were others. Silence settled between us, thick and suffocating. "What are you going to do?" Marcus finally asked. I didn't have an answer. I'd already done the one thing that felt instinctual: I left. But the gnawing ache in my chest told me it wasn't that simple. "They're not mine, Marcus," I repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it feel more real. "But I raised them. I was there for every scraped knee, every school play, every birthday. How do I just turn that off?" Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know, man. But you have to figure out what matters more, the blood or the bond." His words echoed in my mind long after I left his apartment. Blood or bond? That night, alone in the motel, I scrolled through old photos on my phone: Ethan with his goofy grin, Lily's gap-toothed smile, Noah's tiny hand gripping my finger the day he was born. I felt the tears before I realized they were falling. Because no matter what the DNA said, I still loved them. And that was the cruelest part of all. Days passed like a blur, each one bleeding into the next with no distinction. The cheap motel room became my prison, a place where time didn't matter because nothing on the outside seemed real anymore. My phone remained silent now, the frantic calls from Jessica tapering off, as if she'd finally accepted that I wasn't coming back. But the silence was worse than the noise. I stared at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror, searching for something familiar. But all I saw was a man I didn't recognize, unshaven, hollow-eyed, broken. Who was I now? Not a husband. Not a father. Just Daniel Carter, a man whose entire life had been built on lies. But the heart doesn't care about DNA. It doesn't untangle itself from memories because of a few pieces of paper. That was the problem. I still loved them. Ethan, Lily, Noah. They were mine in every way that mattered, except the one that counted. The guilt gnawed at me like a wound that wouldn't close. I'd left without saying goodbye, without an explanation. They deserved more than that. They deserved the truth. But did I have the courage to face them? I found myself parked outside the house a week later, staring at the front door like it was the gate to some dark abyss. The yard looked the same, the swing set I built with Ethan still standing, Lily's bike propped against the garage, Noah's soccer ball resting near the porch steps. A snapshot of a life I no longer belonged to. I almost drove away. But then the door opened, and Ethan stepped out. He was taller than I remembered, his shoulders broader, but his face still held traces of the boy who used to run into my arms after school. He froze when he saw my car, his expression unreadable. I got out slowly, my heart pounding like a war drum. "Hey, kid," I managed, my voice hoarse from days of disuse. Ethan didn't respond at first. He just stared, his jaw clenched tight. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back inside. Rejection burned hotter than I'd expected. But I wasn't leaving. Not this time. I approached the door, my hands shaking as I knocked. A few seconds later, Jessica appeared, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Daniel," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Is it okay if I come in?" I asked quietly. She stepped aside without a word, and I entered the house that used to be my home. The familiar scent hit me immediately: coffee, lavender, a hint of the vanilla candles Jessica loved. It was like stepping into a photograph, everything frozen in time while I had been unraveling elsewhere. The kids sat on the couch, their faces a mixture of confusion, anger, and sadness. Ethan wouldn't look at me. Lily clutched a stuffed bear I'd won for her at the county fair, and Noah's eyes were wide with questions he didn't know how to ask. I sat in the armchair across from them, feeling like an intruder. "I owe you an explanation," I began, my voice trembling. "I left because I found out something that broke me. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then why did you leave?" His words hit me harder than any punch. "Because I didn't know who I was anymore," I admitted. "I found out. I'm not your biological father." Silence. Lily's eyes filled with tears, her lip quivering. Noah didn't seem to understand, but Ethan's face hardened into something I'd never seen before. "So what?" he snapped. "You're still our dad." My chest caved under the weight of his words. "I thought that's what I believed, too," I whispered. "But when I found out, it felt like everything I knew about myself, about us, was a lie. I didn't know how to process it. I was angry, hurt, and I ran." Jessica sobbed quietly in the corner, but I didn't look at her. My focus was on the kids, the only thing that mattered. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I was wrong to leave. You didn't deserve that." Ethan stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "You think DNA makes you a dad? You're the one who taught me how to ride a bike. You're the one who sat with me when I had the flu, who helped me with my math homework, who showed up to every soccer game. That's what matters." Tears streamed down Lily's face as she ran to me, wrapping her small arms around my neck. Noah followed, burying his face in my chest. I held them both, my heart shattering all over again, but this time from something different, not betrayal, but regret. Ethan didn't move. He just stood there, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "I don't care about some stupid test," he muttered. "You're my dad. You'll always be my dad." I broke down completely then, sobbing into Lily's hair, holding Noah so tightly I thought I'd never let go. When I finally looked up, Ethan's eyes met mine, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something I thought I'd lost forever: hope. But hope isn't enough to fix what's broken. As the days passed, I stayed longer each time I visited. I tried to reclaim pieces of the life I'd abandoned. But there was always a shadow lingering between us, a shadow named Jessica. The trust was gone. And while I still loved my kids, I didn't know if I could live under the same roof with the woman who'd built our life on lies. So I faced a new question, one I didn't know how to answer. How do you move forward when the past won't let go? Moving forward isn't as simple as apologizing and picking up where you left off. I learned that the hard way. The house felt smaller every time I visited, the walls closing in with the weight of everything unsaid. I could hug my kids, sit through dinners filled with forced conversation, but nothing felt the same. The warmth was gone, replaced by an invisible chasm that no amount of time seemed able to bridge. Jessica tried to pretend. She'd put on a brave face, cook my favorite meals, and ask about my day like we were still the same people. But we weren't. I could see the cracks in her mask, how her hands trembled when she poured coffee, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, she cornered me in the kitchen. The overhead light flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the room. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice hesitant. "We need to talk." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, bracing myself. "I know things can't go back to the way they were overnight," We can't live like this. You come, you go. The kids are confused. I'm confused. She swallowed hard. Are you ever coming home for good? I stared at her, searching for the woman I'd married, the woman I thought I knew. But all I saw was a stranger. I don't know, I replied honestly. I'm trying to figure that out. Jessica's face crumpled slightly. I made mistakes, Daniel. Terrible mistakes. But we had a life together. A family. Doesn't that count for something? I wanted to scream, to tell her that love isn't supposed to be a math equation where betrayal gets balanced out by years of good memories. But instead I just said, it counts. But it doesn't erase the truth. She didn't respond. She just nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to shed. I left that night without saying goodbye to the kids. It was easier that way, less questions, fewer explanations I didn't have answers for. Back at the motel, I sat in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, staring at the same cracked ceiling, the air thick with regrets. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Marcus. Marcus, you alive over there? Bear's cold if you need to talk. I hesitated before replying. Me, on my way. His apartment was the opposite of my motel room, cluttered with pizza boxes, laundry piled on the chair, but somehow it felt more like home than where I'd just come from. Marcus handed me a beer without a word, and we sat in silence for a while, the TV flickering in the background. Finally, he broke the silence. You look like hell. Feel like it. I took a long sip, letting the bitter taste wash down the knot in my throat. So, what's the plan? You gonna move back in or what? I shook my head. I don't know if I can. Marcus leaned back, resting his feet on the coffee table. Look, man, I'm no expert in relationships, but here's the thing, you still love those kids, right? Of course. And they still love you? Yeah. Then that's your family? Jessica? She's just part of the damage. But the kids? They're your anchor. His words stuck with me long after I left his place. The next day, I did something I hadn't done since the day I found out the truth. I picked Ethan up from school. When he saw me waiting by the car, his face lit up, and for a fleeting moment, I felt like his dad again. Thought you forgot how to drive, he joked, sliding into the passenger seat. I chuckled, but it felt hollow. Figured I owed you a ride. We drove in silence for a bit, the kind of comfortable quiet I used to cherish. But it wasn't the same. Ethan, I finally said, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. How are you, really? He shrugged, staring out the window. I'm fine. You don't have to lie to me. He exhaled sharply. I don't know. It sucks. You're here, but you're not really here. Mom cries when she thinks we're not looking. Lily asks about you all the time. And Noah. His voice trailed off. I swallowed hard. I'm trying, kid. I really am. I just what? He turned to face me, his jaw clenched, eyes blazing with the kind of anger only a teenager can muster. You think it's hard for you? You think finding out you're not our biological dad makes you the victim? You're still here. You still get to choose. We didn't get that choice. His words hit harder than any punch. I pulled over to the side of the road, my chest tight. You're right, I whispered. You didn't get a choice. And I'm sorry. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared out the window again, his silence louder than any scream. That night, I sat in the motel, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. Marcus's words echoed in my head. The kids are your anchor. Maybe I couldn't fix what Jessica broke. Maybe I'd never be able to look at her without seeing the betrayal. But the kids? They were still mine in every way that mattered. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my bags, checked out of the motel, and drove back to the house. My heart pounded as I stood at the front door, keys in hand. Jessica opened it before I could knock, her eyes red-rimmed, like she hadn't slept. I didn't wait for her to speak. I'm moving back in, I said. Her face lit up with hope, but I held up a hand. This isn't about us. It's about them. The kids need me. And I need them. She nodded slowly, understanding without me having to explain. I walked past her into the house, greeted by the familiar scent of home. Ethan peeked around the corner, his eyes widening when he saw me with my bag. Are you staying? He asked cautiously. I nodded. Yeah. I'm staying. His face softened, the tension melting away just a little. Maybe this wasn't the ending I wanted. But it was a start. And sometimes that's enough. Moving back into the house felt like stepping onto the set of a life I no longer belonged to. Everything was familiar, photos on the walls, the faint scent of laundry detergent Jessica always used, the worn spot on the couch where I used to sit with Ethan during movie nights. But it all felt distant, like echoes of a past I couldn't reach. The kids' reactions were a mix of relief and confusion. Ethan barely acknowledged me that first night, retreating to his room with his headphones on. Lily clung to me like I'd never left, while Noah hovered close, too young to understand the complexities but old enough to sense the tension. Jessica tried to act normal, slipping into her old routines, making dinner, asking me about my day, but her presence was a constant reminder of the betrayal I couldn't shake. Every glance, every forced smile felt like sandpaper against an open wound. I wasn't home. I was haunting it. The first few weeks were a delicate balancing act. I slept in the guest room, the space cold and impersonal, a stark contrast to the warmth I once shared with Jessica. We spoke only when necessary, discussions about the kids' schedules, school projects, and grocery lists. The rest was silence, thick and suffocating. I focused on the kids. I picked Ethan up from soccer practice, helped Lily with her homework, read bedtime stories to Noah. It should have felt fulfilling, grounding. But every moment was tainted by the question I couldn't escape: was this enough? Ethan was the hardest to reach. His anger simmered beneath the surface, erupting in small bursts, slammed doors, curt responses, a cold shoulder that stung more than any harsh word. One evening, after another silent dinner, I found him shooting hoops alone in the driveway. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. I stood by the porch, watching him for a while before finally gathering the courage to approach. "Mind if I join?" I asked. He didn't answer, just tossed me the ball. I took the shot, the ball bouncing off the rim with a hollow thud. "Used to be better at this," I muttered, retrieving the ball. Ethan shrugged. "Maybe you just quit practicing." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. I nodded slowly. "Yeah. Maybe I did." We played in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the rhythmic bounce of the ball, and the occasional swish of a successful shot. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "I'm sorry, Ethan." He froze, the ball resting against his hip. "For what? Leaving? Or coming back?" I swallowed hard. "For all of it." He didn't respond right away. Then, with a bitter laugh, he said, "You think that fixes anything?" "No," I admitted. "I just don't know what else to say." Ethan's jaw clenched. "You didn't have to leave, you know. We didn't care about the DNA stuff. You're still our dad." His words were both a gift and a curse. "I didn't leave because of you," I said quietly. "I left because I didn't know who I was anymore. Everything I thought I knew about my life was gone, and I didn't know how to face it, or face you." Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of resentment and something softer, hurt. "You could have just talked to us," he muttered, shooting the ball again. It sailed clean through the hoop. "Yeah," I whispered. "I should have." We didn't solve anything that night, but it was the first real conversation we'd had since I left. A small crack in the wall between us. Days turned into weeks, and I settled into a new version of our old life. I went to work, helped with the kids, shared meals under the weight of unspoken words. Jessica kept her distance, and I was grateful for it. Until the night she didn't. I was in the guest room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when there was a soft knock on the door. Before I could respond, Jessica stepped in, her arms crossed, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I didn't want to. But avoiding her wasn't going to make anything better. "Sure." She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I need to know. Are we ever going to be okay?" The question hit harder than I expected. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't think I can ever look at you the same way again." She nodded slowly, her eyes glassy. "I deserve that." Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered. "I was selfish and stupid, and I ruined everything. But I still love you, Daniel." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in months. She was the same woman I'd married, but also a stranger. The love I'd once felt was buried under layers of betrayal, like trying to find warmth under a blanket of ice. "I don't know if that matters anymore," I said quietly. Her face crumpled, tears slipping down her cheeks. I didn't reach for her. I couldn't. I don't know how to live like this," she sobbed. "Neither do I." She left the room without another word, and I sat there, staring at the closed door, feeling both relief and grief. Because that was the truth, we were both trapped in a life we didn't recognize anymore. And love wasn't enough to save it. A few days later, I got a call from my sister, Rachel. She lived 2 towns over and had always been the blunt one in the family. "So, what's the plan?" she asked after I gave her the rundown. "I don't have one," I admitted. "Well, that's your first problem. You can't just exist in limbo forever, Daniel. Either you forgive her or you don't. But you can't keep pretending this isn't killing you." Her words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. Forgive her, or don't. It sounded simple. But nothing about this was simple. The next morning, I found Jessica in the kitchen, staring out the window, a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. "We need to talk," I said. She turned slowly, her face a mixture of hope and fear. "I can't do this," I continued. "I can't pretend we're okay. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you. But the kids, they deserve more than this. They deserve parents who aren't stuck in the past." Her lips trembled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need space. Real space." The words felt like ripping off a band-aid, exposing a wound that never healed. "But what about the kids?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "We'll figure it out. Together. As co-parents. But not as this." I gestured between us, the broken pieces of a marriage we couldn't glue back together. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she nodded. And just like that, it was over. Not with a fight. Not with screaming. Just with the quiet realization that some things can't be fixed. Part 6. The New Normal. Moving out felt both familiar and foreign. I'd done it before when I left after the DNA results, but this time was different. This wasn't a reaction. It was a choice. A final one. I didn't pack in a rush. There was no rage, no shattered plates, no screaming matches. Just quiet, steady movements, folding clothes, boxing up books, deciding which things were mine and which were part of the life I was leaving behind. Jessica hovered in the background, saying nothing. Her face was a mask of controlled emotion, but I could see the cracks. Her clenched jaw, the way she twisted her wedding ring around her finger out of habit before realizing it wasn't there anymore. She'd stopped wearing it weeks ago. I'd stopped noticing even before that. The kids were upstairs. We hadn't told them yet. I was dreading it. Not because I thought they'd fall apart. They were stronger than I gave them credit for. But because it would make everything real. Saying it out loud would strip away the fragile illusion we'd been holding on to. By the time I'd loaded the last box into my car, the sun was starting to set. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, too beautiful for a day like this. Jessica stood on the porch as I turned back to the house, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. "I'll get the kids," she whispered. I nodded, my chest tightening. A few minutes later, Ethan, Lily, and Noah sat on the couch, their faces filled with varying degrees of confusion and dread. They knew something was wrong. Kids always know. I cleared my throat, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. I need to talk to you guys. I started, sitting on the edge of the coffee table so I could face them. Your mom and we've decided it's best if I move out for a while. Lily's face crumpled instantly, tears spilling over as she buried her face in her hands. Noah didn't understand. He was too young, but the sadness in his wide, innocent eyes was enough to break me. Ethan just stared at me, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. For a while? He repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. You mean forever? I didn't have the strength to lie. Yeah, I whispered. Probably. Lily sobbed quietly, Jessica kneeling beside her, wrapping her arms around her trembling shoulders. Noah climbed into my lap, his little arms clutching my neck like if he held on tight enough, I wouldn't go. Why? He whispered against my shoulder. Don't you love us any more? That question hit harder than anything Jessica had ever done to me. I hugged him tighter, my own tears blurring the room. I love you more than anything, I choked out. This isn't about that. It's not your fault. None of this is your fault. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. But you're still leaving. I didn't know what to say to that. Because he was right. When I finally pried Noah off me, his sobs echoed in my ears long after I closed the door behind me. My new apartment was small, just a one-bedroom with cheap linoleum floors and peeling paint in the bathroom. But it was mine. The first night alone was the hardest. I stared at the ceiling, the silence screaming louder than anything I'd left behind. I missed the sounds of the kids' laughter, the soft creak of the floorboards outside my bedroom, even Jessica's soft breathing beside me in the dark. I thought I'd feel free. Instead, I felt hollow. Weeks passed. I saw the kids every other weekend, sometimes during the week if my schedule allowed. But it wasn't the same. I wasn't there to kiss them goodnight or make pancakes on Saturday mornings. I missed the small things, the things you don't realize matter until they're gone. Ethan stayed distant, his texts short and infrequent. Lily called me almost every night, crying at first, then just to hear my voice. Noah adjusted the quickest, but kids his age don't understand the permanence of things. He still thought I'd come back eventually. Jessica and I communicated only about the kids, school events, doctor's appointments, drop-offs, pickups. Civil, polite, empty. Until one day, she called when she didn't have to. I was at the apartment, eating cold leftovers, when my phone buzzed. Jessica, can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Me, about what? Jessica, us. I hesitated but agreed. Not because I wanted to, but because part of me needed to hear whatever she had to say. When I arrived at the house that no longer felt like mine, Jessica was waiting on the porch. She looked different. Not just tired or sad, but resigned. Like she'd finally accepted something she'd been fighting against. I'm not here to change your mind, she said before I could even speak. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. Not just the affair, but for how I handled everything after. I should have been honest from the start. I nodded slowly. Yeah. You should have. Silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we'd never say. I miss you, she whispered. Those words didn't sting like I thought they would. They just felt empty. I miss who I thought you were, I replied. She nodded, tears filling her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. That's fair. I left without saying goodbye. Because there was nothing left to say. Months passed. The seasons changed. I settled into my new life, but the ache never really went away. I was a father without a family. A man without a home. But I was learning to live with it. Because sometimes, survival isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about learning to carry the pieces. It's strange how life moves on even when you're standing still. The world didn't pause to acknowledge my broken family. The sun kept rising, people kept rushing to work, couples still held hands in grocery store aisles like the universe hadn't cracked wide open for me. I adapted, or at least pretended to. My apartment grew less empty as I filled it with furniture, plants that would probably die, and framed pictures of the kids. I smiled in some of those photos, but every time I looked at them, it felt like staring at a ghost, someone who didn't exist anymore. Co-parenting became a routine. Jessica and I exchanged civil texts, coordinating drop-offs and school events like business transactions. There was no warmth, no lingering looks, just an undercurrent of shared history we both tried to ignore. But the kids, they were my anchor and my torment. One Saturday morning, I picked them up for the weekend. The car ride was unusually quiet. Noah stared out the window, Lily fiddled with her bracelet, and Ethan barely looked at me. When we got to my apartment, I tried to break the silence. "Pizza for lunch?" I asked, forcing a smile. Noah nodded eagerly. Lily shrugged. Ethan didn't respond. While the younger two settled in, Ethan stayed glued to his phone, scrolling with the kind of detachment that felt like a knife. I sat beside him on the couch. "Hey," I said softly. "Talk to me." He sighed, locking his phone but not looking at me. "What's the point? You're just gonna leave again." His words hit harder than I expected, sharper than any argument Jessica and I ever had. "I'm not going anywhere, Ethan." He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with anger and something worse, disappointment. "You left before. You always leave." I opened my mouth to respond but realized I had nothing to say. He was right. I did leave. Twice. But I couldn't change that. All I could do was show up now. So I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just said, "I'm sorry." Ethan stood up and walked to his room, leaving me alone with my guilt. The next day, I decided to try again. "Let's go to the park," I announced, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. Noah lit up. Lily hesitated but agreed. Ethan? Same indifference. But he came. At the park, Noah ran ahead, his laughter carrying on the breeze. Lily collected leaves, her small fingers tracing patterns on each one. Ethan stayed behind, slouched on a bench, headphones in. I sat beside him, not saying anything. Just sitting. After a while, he pulled out one earbud. "You don't have to try so hard, you know," he muttered. "I'm not trying. I'm just here." He glanced at me, skepticism written all over his face. "Why'd you really leave?" The question caught me off guard. I thought I'd answered it before, but maybe I hadn't. Not really. I was angry. Hurt. I felt like everything I knew was a lie. And instead of dealing with it, I ran. Ethan didn't respond. "I thought leaving would make it easier," I continued. "But it didn't. It just made me realize that you, Lily, and Noah, you're not part of my life. You are my life." For the first time in months, his expression softened, just a little. He didn't say anything, but when we walked back to the car, he didn't put his headphones back in. It was progress. Later that evening, after I'd dropped them off at Jessica's, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the photos on the wall. I thought about how easy it was to break things, and how hard it was to fix them. I picked up my phone and texted Jessica. Can we talk?" Her reply came quickly. "Jessica, sure. Tomorrow?" I wasn't sure why I reached out. Maybe because, despite everything, there were still things left unsaid. The next day, we met at a small cafe. Neutral ground. She looked different, tired maybe, but stronger somehow. "I didn't expect to hear from you," she said, stirring her coffee. "I've been thinking," I replied. "About us. About everything." She nodded, waiting. "I can't forgive you," I admitted. "Not completely. But I don't want to hate you either. It's exhausting." Jessica's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just nodded. "I don't expect your forgiveness," she whispered. "I just want us to be okay. For the kids." "For the kids," I echoed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just for them. It was for me, too. Because holding on to the past was like drinking poison and expecting her to die from it. I needed to let go. Not for her. For me. Weeks turned into months. Ethan started opening up more. We'd shoot hoops, sometimes talk about school, even girls. Lily still called me every night. Noah never stopped believing I'd come back. And maybe, in a way, I did. Not as the man I was, but as the man I was trying to become. Because family isn't about blood. It's about showing up. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running anymore. Time has a strange way of healing wounds, or at least covering them with enough scar tissue that you stop picking at them every day. Months had passed since I'd moved out of the house. The kids had adjusted to the new routine, or at least pretended to. Jessica and I had found a rhythm too, though it was more like an awkward dance, stepping around the past, careful not to trip over memories. But the thing about scars is they don't disappear. They just fade until you think you've forgotten them. Then one day, something, a word, a place, a random scent, rips them open again. And that's exactly what happened. It was a Saturday afternoon. The kids were with me, and we decided to go to the local fall festival, a tradition we'd once done as a family. I hesitated at first, worried it would dredge up too many memories. But Ethan had shrugged and said, "It's just a festival, Dad." Like it wasn't loaded with a decade of family photos and pumpkin spice nostalgia. So we went. Noah ran ahead, eager to get to the petting zoo. Lily clung to my hand, pointing out every booth with glitter and crafts. Ethan walked beside me, his hands shoved into his hoodie pocket, his face locked in that teenage expression somewhere between boredom and mild interest. For a moment, it felt almost normal. Until I saw Jessica. She was at one of the vendor stalls, laughing. Not the forced, polite laugh I'd grown used to before everything fell apart. This was the real one. The one I hadn't heard in years. And she wasn't alone. The man beside her was tall, well-dressed, and too comfortable standing that close. His hand brushed against hers as they looked at something on display, and she didn't pull away. I froze. Ethan noticed first, following my gaze. His jaw tightened. "That's Mom's new friend," he muttered, the word dripping with sarcasm. I didn't respond. Couldn't. I wasn't sure what hit harder, the sight of her with someone else, or the realization that I had no right to feel anything about it. But I did. A lot. The rest of the festival was a blur. I plastered on a smile, bought caramel apples, and pretended I wasn't unraveling inside. Back at the apartment, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat alone in the dark, a beer in one hand, my thoughts in the other. Why did it bother me so much? I'd left. I'd been the one who walked away. I didn't love her, not anymore. But maybe that was the problem. It wasn't about love. It was about the fact that while I was still stuck in the wreckage, Jessica had found a way to move on. And I hadn't. The next time I saw her was during a drop-off. She was polite, casual, like nothing had changed. Like I hadn't seen her laughing with another man, her eyes lit up in a way I thought only I could cause. But I couldn't ignore it. "So, new guy?" I blurted, unable to help myself. Jessica blinked, surprised by my bluntness. Then she sighed. "His name's Ryan." Of course, he had a name like Ryan. That was fast, I muttered, regretting it as soon as the words left my mouth. She didn't snap back, didn't get defensive. She just gave me a look, a sad, tired one. "It's been almost a year, Daniel." And just like that, I realized she was right. A year. 12 months of picking up the pieces while life moved on without me. I didn't say anything else. Just nodded and left. But the conversation stuck with me. Not because Jessica was dating someone new, but because it forced me to confront the thing I'd been avoiding. I was still living in the past. That night, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Same face. Same tired eyes. But something shifted inside me. I couldn't stay frozen forever. So I did something I hadn't done in months. I signed up for an online dating app. It felt ridiculous. My profile was awkward. I had no idea what to write. Divorced dad of 3, emotionally damaged but working on it. Didn't seem like the best tagline. But I did it anyway. And within a few days I had my first date. Her name was Emily. She was kind, funny, and refreshingly normal. We met for coffee, talked about books, music, and our mutual hatred for small talk. It wasn't earth-shattering. But it was something. A step. I didn't tell the kids right away. I wasn't sure if it even mattered yet. But after a few dates, I realized I wasn't hiding it because of them. I was hiding it from myself. Because moving on felt like admitting that the life I'd lost was really gone. Eventually, I told Ethan first. We were in the car, heading to one of his soccer games. So, I started awkwardly. I've been seeing someone. He didn't react at first, just kept scrolling on his phone. Then he said, "Cool. As long as she's not a psycho." I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Not a psycho. I promised. Lily took it harder when I told her. She was quiet, her little brows furrowed like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "But do you still love Mommy?" she asked softly. That question felt like a punch. "No, sweetie," I said gently. "But I did once. And I'll always care about her because she's your mom. But sometimes people grow apart. That doesn't mean we stop loving you." She nodded slowly, then asked, "Is she nice?" "She's very nice." Lily thought for a moment. Then she smiled. "Okay." And just like that, the weight lifted a little. Seeing Jessica after that was different. I didn't feel anger anymore. Or jealousy. Just acceptance. She'd moved on. And now so had I. Maybe not completely. Maybe the scars would always be there. But for the first time in a long time, they didn't hurt as much. And that was enough. Moving on isn't like flipping a switch. It's messy. Some days you feel like you're finally breathing again, and other days the past grabs you by the throat and drags you back. Emily and I kept seeing each other. She was easy to talk to, no history, no complicated layers of betrayal. Just simple. And after everything I'd been through, simple felt like a luxury. But life has a funny way of testing you the moment you think you're getting comfortable. It happened on a random Thursday. I was at Ethan's soccer game, sitting alone in the bleachers, when I saw Jessica. She was with him, Ryan. The guy from the festival. They looked like a couple now, standing close, her hand resting lightly on his arm. I wasn't expecting it to hurt. I thought I'd moved past that. But seeing her like that, with someone who wasn't me, felt like an old wound ripping open. Ethan scored a goal, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Jessica and Ryan clapped, beaming with pride. I clapped too, but it felt forced, like I was playing a part in a scene I didn't audition for. After the game, as Ethan jogged over, sweaty and grinning, he high-fived Ryan without hesitation. It was a simple gesture, but it hit me like a freight train. That used to be my role. Later that night, I couldn't shake the image from my head. I sat in my apartment, staring at nothing, letting the silence swallow me. Emily texted, asking if I wanted to meet up. I almost said no. But instead I typed, "Yeah, I'd like that." When I saw her, I didn't tell her about Jessica and Ryan. I didn't want to admit that it still bothered me. But Emily knew something was off. She always did. "You're quiet," she said gently, sipping her coffee. I stared at my cup, swirling the contents aimlessly. "It's nothing." She gave me a look, the kind that says, "Don't insult me with that answer." So I told her. About the game. About Jessica. About Ryan. When I finished, Emily didn't say, "You shouldn't feel that way or just get over it." She just nodded and said, "Of course it hurts. She was part of your life for a long time. That doesn't just disappear." Her words settled over me like a weighted blanket, not comforting, exactly, but grounding. "Does it ever stop hurting?" I asked quietly. Emily thought for a moment. "I don't think it stops. I think you just get used to it. Like an old scar, you don't notice it every day, but it's always there. She was right. The next time I saw Jessica, it was during a drop-off. She looked happy. Genuinely happy. And for the first time, it didn't sting as much. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, but as I turned to leave, she called out, "Daniel, wait!" I paused, my heart doing that annoying thing where it braces for something heavy. She stepped closer, her expression softer than I'd seen in a long time. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "For not making this harder than it had to be. For being there for the kids. For still showing up." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to shrug it off, but her words settled somewhere deep. "You're their mom," I replied. "And they're my kids. That's never going to change." She nodded, blinking back tears she didn't want to show. And that was it. No grand apology. No dramatic reconciliation. Just two people acknowledging the mess they'd survived. Later that week, Emily and I were walking through the park when she stopped suddenly, turning to face me. "Do you still love her?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment, really thought about it. "No," I said honestly. "But I think a part of me will always care. Not because I want her back, but because she's part of my story." Emily smiled softly. "Good. Because I don't want to compete with a ghost." I laughed, a real, genuine laugh. And for the first time, the past felt like just that. The past. Ethan's soccer season ended with a championship game. We all went, Jessica, Ryan, Emily, the kids. We even sat near each other. It was weird. But it was okay. When Ethan scored the winning goal, we all cheered. Jessica hugged Ryan. I high-fived Emily. And for a brief moment, everything felt normal. Maybe not the normal I had before. But a new kind of normal. And that was enough. Life has a way of settling into new rhythms, even after everything's been broken. The cracks don't disappear, they just stop feeling like open wounds. That's what I'd come to realize. Some pain doesn't go away, you just learn how to carry it without letting it crush you. It had been over 2 years since the truth unraveled my life. 2 years since the DNA results, the fights, the nights spent staring at ceilings, wondering where it all went wrong. 2 years of navigating the jagged edges of co-parenting, new relationships, and the echoes of a family that no longer existed the way it once did. But despite all of that, I was still standing. And somehow, that felt like enough. It was Ethan's high school graduation that brought everything full circle. The ceremony was held on the football field, rows of folding chairs stretching out under the June sun. Families gathered with balloons, cameras, and signs scribbled with congratulations. The kind of event that should have felt simple. But for me, it wasn't. I sat in the crowd, Emily beside me, her hand resting gently on my knee. Jessica and Ryan were a few rows ahead, surrounded by her family, people I'd once called mine too. The principal droned on about hard work, dedication, and bright futures, but I'd barely heard any of it. My eyes stayed fixed on Ethan, standing tall in his cap and gown, his face a mix of pride and teenage indifference. When they called his name, I felt something crack open inside me, not pain, exactly, but something just as sharp. Pride. Because regardless of what any DNA test said, that was my son walking across the stage. After the ceremony, we met up near the field. Ethan's siblings tackled him with hugs, and Jessica snapped pictures, her smile easy and genuine. When our eyes met, there was no tension. No awkwardness. Just a silent understanding. She walked over, Ryan in tow. "Hey," she said softly. "Big day." "Yeah," I replied, my voice catching slightly. "It really is." There was a pause, the kind that used to feel unbearable but now just felt normal. "I'm glad you're here," she added quietly. "I wouldn't miss it." Ethan approached then, his diploma in hand, his grin wide and unapologetically proud. He hugged Jessica, fist-bumped Ryan, then turned to me. We stood there for a moment, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. "I'm proud of you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thanks, Dad," he replied without hesitation. Dad. That word hit me harder than anything else. Not because it was new, but because after everything, it still belonged to me. Later that evening, we had a small celebration at my apartment. Nothing fancy, just pizza, cake, and the people who mattered. At one point, I found myself on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. Ethan joined me, leaning against the railing. "You okay?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with something deeper. I nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" I glanced at him, then back at the view. "About how life doesn't always turn out the way you expect. But sometimes, that's okay." Ethan didn't respond right away. Then he said, "I know it wasn't easy, for any of us. But you never gave up on us. That's what matters." I swallowed hard, emotions threatening to spill over. "Thanks, kid," I whispered. He smiled, then added, "You're not that bad for an old man, you know." I laughed, ruffling his hair. It wasn't the life I'd planned. But it was a life I'd fought for. And in the end, that was enough. Years later, I found myself flipping through an old photo album. Pictures from before everything fell apart, family vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings filled with wide-eyed wonder. But instead of feeling the sharp sting of loss, I felt something different. Gratitude. Because even though that chapter of my life ended in heartbreak, it also gave me the greatest gifts I could have asked for: Ethan, Lily, and Noah. And no piece of paper could ever take that away. I closed the album, my heart full. Not with regret, but with peace. Because sometimes, the most beautiful stories are the ones written in the ashes of what we thought we'd lost.